Hello, everyone, and welcome to the sixth and final session of the Infrastructure and Nature webinar series. We've been working our way through the infrastructure lifecycle through 5 sessions that started back in early October. We've explored policy, planning, finance, design for nature-based solutions, and balancing ecological connectivity and linear infrastructure. And now we're here today to tie all of those sessions together. My name is Ryan Bartlett. I'm the Director for Climate Risk Management and Resilience at WWF here based in Washington, DC. And I've had the privilege of organizing this series and introducing the session today. So last year, a group of individuals from over 20 organizations, ranging from NGOs to companies to multilateral development banks and research institutions, came together to organize and co-host a week-long pavilion at the IUCN World Conservation Congress. Topic was, how can we deliver the infrastructure we need while restoring biodiversity, building resilience, and creating a just and carbon neutral future? The pavilion was designed to explore how the private sector, civil society, and government can work together to reimagine 2 things. 1, how can we develop the built infrastructure of our future to ensure a healthy planet and thriving communities? And 2, how can we both protect and support the essential benefits that intact, connected ecosystems provide for people and the planet? So the topic of today's discussion, as I mentioned, is about discussing deeper those challenges and solutions we've discussed throughout the series in trying to achieve these 2 objectives. Our goal today is to provide ideas and recommendations for the 2021 delayed super year of negotiations in climate, biodiversity, sustainable development, and economic recovery. So to take advantage of the ongoing shutdown, our group decided to go ahead and start the discussions for the World Conservation Congress, which has since been delayed until the fall of 2021. So we've had this virtual pavilion these last 2 months, and this is our final session of our first series. We're hoping to hold a second series. I'll tell you more about that at the end of today. The discussions to date have been fascinating, really excellent. I encourage you to go look for them online, and we'll share the link with you later today. And surely today's session will continue this trend. We have an incredible lineup of speakers, and I'm really excited to hear what they're going to say. So if you have any questions for speakers as you hear their remarks, please add them to the Q&A function. You can use that, and we will try to answer your questions as we go. So to lead the way today, our moderator is Roberto Mezzalama. He's an ecologist and environmental engineer, and he spent the first part of his career in the public sector, and since 2000 is with Golder as a senior environmental and social impact assessment specialist. He has directed ESIA studies for large infrastructure projects in North America, Europe, Central Asia, and Africa. Roberto, over to you.
Thank you very much, Ryan, and thank you to the organizer for inviting me to be the moderator today. Without much more ado, I think I will introduce our keynote speaker, who is Siri Sendashonga, that is Global Director for Policy and the Program Group at IUCN. And the topic of our talk today is the overall role of IUCN and the World Conservation in driving action in sustainable development, including infrastructure, and on the importance of infrastructure setting in meeting the objectives, and particularly in terms of ecological connectivity and sustainable infrastructure. Siri is a global director of the IUCN Policy and Program Group, and she's a biologist by training, holds a Master of Science and a PhD degree in zoology from the Free University of Brussels. Siri, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Roberto, and thank you, Ryan, and thank you, everybody in this meeting. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be. So it's a privilege and a pleasure for me to give the keynote address for this webinar, representing our Director General, Bruno Oberle, who would have liked to be in this meeting, but for reasons beyond his control, he couldn't, and therefore he has asked me to stand in for him. And the topic that you have assigned to IUCN for this webinar about the role of IUCN and our World Conservation Congress in driving action in sustainable development including infrastructure. And to shed some light on the importance of the infrastructure sector in meeting the objectives of the particular, some of our policy tools dealing with ecological connectivity and sustainable infrastructure. So allow me in beginning to quote from some words from the recent speech on the state of the planet that the UN Secretary General made a few days ago, which was a very passionate, very compelling, and very powerful speech in which he said, 2020 was supposed to have been a super year for nature, but the pandemic has had other plans for us. Now we must use 2021 to address our planetary emergency. I think we all really can align to those words. And indeed, 2020 did not become the super year in the manner that we thought, but a lot of the events that were supposed to take place this year have all been shifted to next year, 2021. And then, therefore, the 2021 will provide the opportunity to share our collective voice on the many links between nature and infrastructure. The major one, obviously, speaking from our point of view, charity begins at home, as they say, is the IUCN Congress, as the moderator said, will take part in the second half of the year, probably around September 2021. The exact dates will soon be communicated. And we look forward during the Congress to host an infrastructure and nature stand as part of the Congress exhibition space. And the Congress will be a great opportunity to continue to exchange with other conservation organizations and governments, but also indigenous peoples' organizations and businesses. And I am pleased to confirm that in spite of the postponed Congress, IUCN members have actually started to work virtually, to keep the momentum going. And a number of motions have already been voted electronically, and I will come back to that in a moment. And then we have some other major policy arenas that will happen, not the least the Conference of the Parties of the 3 Rio Conventions, the CBD, the Climate Change Convention, as well as the Convention to Combat Desertification, which will all be convening in 2021. I believe that some of these those conventions have some representatives in this webinar. I think I have seen on the agenda somebody from CBD, so I guess they will have, the person will tell us more about the CBD. All I can say at this moment is that, again, because IUCN is really heavily involved in and engaged in the CBD processes, that we are looking forward to COP15 of CBD to adopt a new post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, which we think will also have something that talks about the need to transform all major sectors that one way or another have impact on biodiversity. And that goes without saying that the infrastructure sector is a key sector for achieving a sustainable future. And then there will be the COP26 of climate change to be hosted by the United Kingdom in Glasgow. And it will also mark a very important moment for countries to demonstrate greater ambition on their climate commitments across all levels in support of the Paris Agreement, including obviously on green infrastructure and nature-based solutions. And the UK COP presidency has identified nature-based solutions as one of the main thematic priorities for COP26, and IUCN and its members will be supporting the UK government as well as all the parties to the Climate Change Convention in delivering this. And then, as I said, the other Rio Convention being the one on to combat desertification, also having their COP15 next year and discussing issues related to land restoration, as a solution to tackle climate change and biodiversity loss. And as you can see, all of these Rio Conventions are somehow, they have connecting points, and in all of them, there's definitely a room and a need to strengthen the message about the importance of embedding nature in all socioeconomic and development processes. One other at the UN level that we are all familiar with is the high-level political forum that is charged with reviewing progress in implementing the 2030 agenda and the sustainable development goals. Even though goal 9 on infrastructure will not be under review in 2021, but because the whole SDG agenda is an integrated one, there is no doubt that infrastructure, sustainable infrastructure development contributes directly to multiple goals, including those goals that will be under review, like poverty, good health, reduced inequality, climate action, etc. Now, coming back to my own organization, IUCN and the World Conservation Congress that I mentioned at the beginning. And as we said, we have already, our members have been working not to wait for the postponed Congress to delay everything. And one of the things they did recently was actually to adopt electronically a number of motions. Motions are the tools that IUCN uses to define and to design and define its general policy. And once they are adopted, they become known in our jargon as resolutions or recommendations, depending on whom they are addressed to. So in what we have adopted so far recently, there are 3 motions that touch on the subject of today, which I would like to highlight. A motion that focuses on, 2 of them focus on ecological connectivity and sustainable infrastructure. One, which is motion 071, talks about wildlife-friendly linear infrastructure and focuses on the challenges posed by linear infrastructure, the roads, the railways, canals, power lines, etc., in terms of how that might impact biodiversity, and really calling on all actors to make sure that linear infrastructure is developed in a way that does not cause harm to biodiversity. The other motion or resolution rather talks about ecological connectivity conservation in the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework that will be adopted by CBD COP15, as I mentioned. And then we have a resolution on nature-based solutions. This has really become, a kind of a trademark, if I may use that expression, in IUCN. And with the recent approval of an IUCN global standard for nature-based solution, which we think will be a very important tool in helping everybody as a benchmark to measure progress by being able to provide sort of some parameters which can then allow to assess the contribution of different interventions and to evaluate them using similar parameters. So in conclusion, I would like to again congratulate those organizations in this coalition led by our colleague and member WWF for having designed this series of webinars, which we think is really important. And of course, we hope that 2021 will not be a repeat of 2020 with the pandemic continuing or other things that come in to really delay again this important conversation going forward face to face to the extent possible. But even if that was to happen, I think we are now prepared to really live in a world in which we can actually continue to drive action without necessarily having to meet face to face. And finally, as many of our organizations are involved in recovery plans, let's make sure that building back better becomes a reality and does not just remain a jargon. So allow me again to conclude by drawing from the speech of the UN Secretary General. The recovery from the pandemic is an opportunity. It's time to flick the green switch. We have a chance to not simply reset the world economy, but to transform it. A sustainable economy driven by renewable energy will create new jobs, cleaner infrastructure, and a resilient future. And on that note, I thank you all for your kind attention, and I wish you a very, very productive and successful webinar. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Siri. Great, great speech. And I'm glad you mentioned also the Secretary General of the UN, a very inspirational position for sure. I will now just give you a few minutes of my personal perspective as an introduction to the next speakers. And first, I want to start by saying that I am someone that has been working in the past 20 years in the, let's say, at the tail end of the policies and the project, and let's say at the implementation level. And so I want to share in this capacity some of my observations, again, as an introduction. And I think that we need to start with the stark reality. That is that, we are failing to achieve the Aichi targets. And they are still valid, but it's clear at this point that we need to escalate our action, and business as usual is not going to deliver those results. So some of my observations, as I said, are this. I think there is a disconnect between local implementation and national strategic plans. The planning cycles are not in sync with the actual project implementation because of demographic, economic, or other pressures. And so we end up with some countries that even don't have plans, or where plans are superseded by presidential decrees and decisions. So this issue of the planning and the connection between planning and implementation needs to be brought again at the higher level. The second point is that we are still in a world where we have a lot of information, a lot of data, but when you start digging in and you are working on a specific project, you easily find out that data availability and access is still a problem. I think that IUCN can work on this. There is another important opportunity to digitalize the many studies that are conducted in my field. The third is about knowledge and capacity. I think that there is a sort of an inverse relationship between the importance of the biodiversity values at stake and the capacity and experience of the people that have to deal with that. And this is not for a lack of skills and dedication, but because those countries often don't have the resources to carry out that work. I give you two examples. One is, I worked a lot in Gabon, and there is one capable ornithologist in the country. The second best is very far from his level. And, if you try to, ask my friend Pete Lowry of the Missouri Botanical Garden to do a flora study in a country in Africa, he's always too busy. And so are many other people in this field. So I think there is an issue of knowledge and capacity that needs to be addressed. Another issue is about power struggles. Government funders, developers, ultimately, this limits more sustainable infrastructure. So more alignment is also needed. And, also we have increasingly effective solutions, but still we have barriers. One example I want to give is in the engineering norms and in the engineering codes that professional engineers have to stick to, but they do not necessarily deliver in terms of biodiversity. So in essence, I think that we need to take biodiversity out of the bubble of biologists and conservationists and make it really mainstream, educate key actors on the importance of biodiversity, from planners to engineers and architects. We need to harness the demand coming also from a new generation of users and consumers. Nowadays, I can buy an appliance and know what is the impact on energy consumption, but still, I don't know what is the impact on biodiversity on what I buy in the market in terms of services and goods. And finally, I think we need to work also for people and with people. A consultation is essential. I think that Thirza is going to dig deeper into this issue, but we need to make policies more relevant to the local people and think in terms of local development and not just global mega trends. So I think that if we keep pursuing a world of mega cities connected with heavy infrastructure, I think we're going to struggle to deliver, again, what we are looking for here. These are some of my observations that I wanted to share as a general introduction to the panel discussion. And at this point, I want to start with our distinguished panelists. And as it has been said, we have really a wealth of experience and expertise around the table today. So I want to start with Graham Watkins, who's the Chief of Climate Change Division at IDB. And Graham leads the bank effort to support climate policies and planning in South America in particular, and increasing the availability of financing to promote climate transformation, integrating climate into banking operations and promoting knowledge about sustainable infrastructure, climate risk and decarbonization. So the question I have for you, Graham, is IDB has been a leader, in pushing sustainable infrastructure for years now. And in 2017, you led a study on conflict and infrastructure development in Latin America that demonstrated that there are real costs not to address sustainability issues. Do you think that the main conclusions of the report still ring true 3 years later? And where do you see the biggest positive directions for change for greater private sector involvement? Graham, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, and congratulations on this series. I think it's a great effort to really try and bring more attention to this issue as we move forward. The study you mentioned actually looked at conflict in projects in a couple of hundred projects in Latin America and the Caribbean, and sort of evaluated what was going on. And in terms of its relevance, I think it's actually more relevant today than it was in 2017, and it's going to become increasingly relevant as you find that environments become more complex, to be honest, as we move forward. There's going to be less space, there's going to be limited biodiversity, there's going to be more and more interactions between people and infrastructure in the future. So much so that we actually reblogged the study just this year. So we ourselves thought that it was actually increasingly relevant. I also want to say that one of the routes to being able to change how infrastructure is built is through understanding the economics of infrastructure. In essence, looking at how the social, environmental, and institutional issues impinge on the broader economics. And so that study really had three main messages. One was that when you build infrastructure, it's actually a very complex undertaking, and it's got lots of interactions that have to be dealt with. The second is that if you don't do that right, it can be extremely costly for you from a project perspective. And the third is that the way to deal with some of these issues is really upstream. It's really thinking about what the policy and planning is doing before you embark actually on the project itself. And then looking at those three issues, what we found in the study is that all of the causes of conflict actually interact with each other, and they also cascade one against the other. The main drivers of conflict we find were ultimately social. The implications for the people living around the infrastructure was what was causing the problems that then led, because it wasn't managed, led to conflict in the future. This includes lack of flows of benefits to local people, but also the high flow of costs to people that are that no longer can do things that they were previously doing. They lose access to basically things that they were actually, or services that they were actually enjoying in the past. And these are often connected to environmental issues, loss of ecosystems or access to ecosystems, loss of access to water, local water sources. And even in some senses, the concerns were actually driven by broader, more global issues like climate impacts. And what was driving that, in fact, is poor governance, that the projects were badly planned. They were just sort of thrown on in a spatial sense into particular communities, or they weren't thought through. There wasn't enough stakeholder consultation in the planning. There wasn't enough transparency in the planning at the end of the day. Economic issues, direct economic issues, were not the main drivers of the actual conflicts. The conflicts came really from the governance, environmental, and then ultimately how that impacts on people, which sort of makes sense if you take a step backwards. What was very interesting is that when those conflicts actually occurred, projects basically got delayed. They got stopped in some cases, but in almost 81% of the cases, they actually took much longer to implement than they thought they would be. And this actually then leads to costs. So it leads to budget overruns. It leads to additional costs because you have to change your strategy, or if you have to redesign the project or resituate the project or move it around. This is particularly the case when you look at urban infrastructure, and those conflicts sometimes they escalate because they're not managed, because the systems to manage them are not in place, and that can actually lead to cancellation in the long term. In 95% of the cases, it was very difficult, once there was a conflict, for private sector to continue in the future or government to do additional projects. And what we actually found as a summary of these things is we did an assessment of what happens country by country. What we really found is that the best way to manage these conflicts is upstream. The countries with stronger institutional arrangements actually better manage the conflicts and were able to move forward much more effectively. They had less conflicts, and when they had a conflict, they were able to de-escalate the conflict quite quickly. We also found that projects done by IFIs were able to do this as well. And I'll just stop there, but that's the basically summary of what we were doing.
Thank you, Graham. Sorry to jump in, but time is short. I would like now to introduce Norbert Gorrissen, that is the head of the International Policy Directorate at the Federal Environmental Ministry of the German government. Germany is a major bilateral funder of international climate and biodiversity around the world, particularly in emerging markets. What are the ongoing challenges that you see in achieving greater private sector investment in infrastructure projects that both reduce emission and are nature-based? And what do you think are some of the biggest upcoming opportunities to overcome them in the coming year? Norbert, the floor is yours for 3 minutes.
Yes, thank you. Thank you also for inviting me, and also congratulations for this great webinar series. I think it's really touching a very important issue to find solutions how infrastructure could be better integrated in a vital nature. I think for the private sector, from what we heard, first priority for the private sector is to have a really clear long-term targets and goals, which are the basis for everything. What is the government, what is the country expecting on the long run? And I mean here in particular with respect to climate and biodiversity targets. I think that is the basis. The private sector is always asking for long-term signals, and they are missing in many cases. Second level is then to be a little bit more concrete. What does it mean on the ground? What are the legal frameworks? What is the regulatory environment? Are land rights, for instance, one of the most imminent things are clearly regulated? Are they clear? And then the third level is to understand the risks associated with investing in infrastructure in a certain place. So what is the impact it might have on biodiversity, but also on climate, and what are the benefits for an alternative case? And that leads to the fourth point, which is the evidence. The evidence needs to be clear in order to understand that a solution which is embedded in nature and which is relying much more on nature is a better opportunity, and also the more less costly opportunity. So therefore, it first of all really means the private sector needs thorough risk assessments to be provided. And I think that this was already said by you, that the capacity and the knowledge for doing these kind of risk assessments are not always in place. So therefore, what we are doing in the International Climate Initiative, which is a funding program which we have at hand, we work on as one of the projects also to provide climate information for infrastructure projects, which provide guidelines and help to do the right risk assessments for a decision-making process which promotes nature-based solutions. What are the opportunities? That was the second part of your question, and I think the lady from IUCN already introduced many of those points. I would like to highlight them from my perspective. First of all, I think what we know from many case studies is nature-based related infrastructure planning and investing could be less costly and more effective than conventional infrastructure planning and implementation. Secondly, I think we can demonstrate that by using nature-based solutions, we will contribute to the protection of biodiversity, and we also can contribute to addressing climate change, in particular with respect to adaptation. And my final point would be also to mention the context to the green and better recovery, which also had been already mentioned. So we all know very well now that we need to get better out of this crisis, and that means also a better way to plan for future infrastructure, which is really resilient. Thank you.
Thank you, Norbert. And sorry to jump in. I would recommend everyone to stay in the 3 minutes, but thank you very much for your insights. Very interesting. Next speaker is Oliver Hillel, that is from the CBD Secretariat and is leading on mainstreaming biodiversity into economic development. And question for you, Oliver, is this the challenges of integrating nature into business model is at the heart of your work for CBD. So how can we learn from the challenges that we already mentioned in meeting the Aichi targets and achieving more significant progress moving towards the post-2020 framework? And what have been the biggest barriers to successfully mainstreaming? And where do you see the greatest opportunity in 2021? Oliver.
Thank you so much, Roberto. What a great opportunity to be here with you. I'll try to go straight to the point. I think I'll start with mentioning your own comments. I think the biggest barrier here is that mainstreaming, whether it's in infrastructure, whether it's in any of the other sectors that the Convention on Biological Diversity has looked at in the COPs 13 and 14, we still do too little mainstreaming. When you look at national reports of the parties of the CBD, you see that most of them already talk about mainstreaming. But when you look at the actual measures and the proposals, working activities on the ground, they're very rare and in between. So basically, this is still the transversality, the fact that you need to integrate all those things. And the fact that if you look at it, everything, I mean, the loss of biodiversity is caused by human nature, which means that 90 to 95% of the incentives and the economic operations we have today, including on infrastructure, are exactly the factors that have led to this loss. So to reverse this is exactly as you said, Roberto, and some others, to change the codes, to change the blueprints is a very difficult thing, and it is just beginning. So I think, first of all, the barriers are many. Now, what we have learned from the 10 years of trying to put the Aichi biodiversity targets into practice, and that we are applying in the design and the development of the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, is exactly that it needs to be done together. So I have posted on the chat the links to the so-called long-term approach to mainstreaming that the convention has been developing now with many experts, including many of the international organizations and the multilateral banks that are participating in these discussions. By the way, excellent series of seminars. You're really to be congratulated for that. So this is exactly the kind of lesson that we're learning. We had to do an informal advisory group where national governments interacted with development and other finance agents, and also the private sector and civil society. So my lesson has been mostly the co-development of the long-term approach on mainstreaming, which I'd like to invite people to have a look at. And the way we developed it is that the group that developed this determined that there are 5 areas in which mainstreaming could be done. The first is mainstream what we call vertically and horizontally across governments, meaning across all the subject, but also very importantly for infrastructure across the different levels of government. Because very often it is the subnational and local governments that will actually execute a lot of the infrastructure, even if the funding comes from the federal or global level. So harmonizing those levels is very important, as well as involving incentives, which is an extremely important subject for infrastructure, because as we all know, the private sector normally acts upon the parameters given by governments and by finance. And then, of course, we need to involve business by itself. One of the innovations we have, if we separate finance from business, and I'll come back to that very important element, they are not one and the same. And of course, finally, the participation of civil society. So I'd say in terms of lessons learned, it is really the very obvious working together in the development of the new tools. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Oliver. Our next speaker comes from the private sector. Esther Ran, she's the Chief Sustainability Officer of City Development Limited. And she's an active advocate for green building and sustainability, and she's been for 2 decades. And she's been instrumental in establishing CDL leadership in sustainability. And she also chairs the Asia Pacific Real Estate Association Sustainability and ESG Committee. So quite an important voice. And the question for you, Esther, is from your unique perspective from the private finance in the global south, what are the biggest challenges you've seen that prevent more private sector investment in nature-based infrastructure? And how to help meet climate and biodiversity goals? And what opportunities do you see for 2021? Esther.
Okay, hi, thank you for having me. I come from Singapore. It's a very small city-state, but we have the honors to be the greenest Asian city. I think we are, in Singapore, we are very, very fortunate. We have very high green coverage of almost close to 50%. And actually, to me, it is a need because we are near the equator and it is hot throughout the year. And if we do not have like the canopy and the greenery, and can you imagine the urban heat island effect? And the fact is Singapore is even is still hitting twice as fast as other cities in the world. And in the sectors that I come from, which is actually a building and construction sector, we actually are aware of our high energy consumption and accounting for 36% of global final energy consumption and also 39% of direct and indirect CO2 emission. So when we talk about the challenges and incentives of having nature-based or sustainable infrastructure, we can't look at it in silos. We have to look at it in totality and as in an integrated and holistic manner. And private sector alone will not be able to change the whole dynamics, to green the world. We have to look at the alignment. Just now some of the speakers has already talking about the convergence of the goals between global goals, national goals, and also the business objectives as well. And I think if I could just cite Singapore's history, it has about 60 years of greening, heritage. And the first generation leaders of Singapore under Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, he had the vision and the foresight that actually there are a lot of economic and social benefits of greening, keeping Singapore green, a small city with almost zero resources, almost zero agriculture, and what can make this space, this is city-state attractive. So he actually has the vision of like greening it, keep it as like a garden city or city in the garden. And the latest vision is to make Singapore city in nature. So it's really a very visionary objective to help maintain sustainable lifestyle, sustainable infrastructure. That's just private sector alone, you can't do it because our land is mainly from the government. And the Green Building Master Plan also look at a high percentage of energy efficiency, greenhouse gas emission, and but greenery is always maintaining as one of the priorities. So for us as private sector, we also see that interesting part of it, especially after this whole year of lockdown and the COVID and all that. People's appreciation of nature, space, greenery has gone up tremendously. And data show that in average, people spend about 90%, indoor. How do you make greenery, make your indoor space, whether it is working space, home, living space, entertainment space, and F&B, because we actually build both residential home and also working space and also a hotel owner and management. So we have to look at it. How do you bring nature into the space and the space, seamlessly connect to nature? So I talk about a little bit more about product differentiation, marketability, and all that later on. Thank you.
Thank you, Esther. And I'm really sorry to be,
Yeah, I know. Sorry.
such a tough timekeeper. Thank you very much, Esther. Our next speaker is Terza Tipingpo. She's a principal consultant at ICS 3O Global Solutions and lecturer at Harvard Sustainability and Environmental Management Program. And Terza, the question for you is, what are the biggest barriers that you continue to see in developing sustainable infrastructure that also ensure not just strong participation, but benefits for the communities and local voices in the process? Do you see this changing for the better? And what are some of the biggest opportunity you see moving forward? Terza, thank you.
Great, thank you, Roberto. And thanks for having me here today. I've got to say, just quickly, everything quickly, in the time that we have, I've learned a lot already from the previous speakers. So in answer to your question about the challenges, I think they've been well articulated by yourself, Graham, Norbert, and Siri. The challenges of knowledge and capacity development, the cost of conflict, predictability needed in a regulatory and economic environment. These are all things that are challenges. And they're not just challenges for the project proponent or governments or NGOs, they're challenges fundamentally impacting the people who actually live in the areas that these projects occur. So to put a frame around that, I think it's important our definition of sustainable reflect more than just the environmental and economic implications. Sustainable infrastructure has to consider, like I said, the place and the people where it's built as the starting point. Everybody that's spoken so far has been speaking about people. So let me illuminate that just for a moment and talk about my work, which is focused on that juxtaposition of development, environment, and communities. That focus began with my lived experience as an indigenous person, as my family's from Utqiagvik on the edge of the Arctic Ocean, and has been doing business for over 10,000 years in an environment that would kill most people in 12 hours. It is a community today, my community, in 2020, deriving 50% of our food supply from hunting, primarily bowhead whales. This is a subsistence economy. This is not a cash-based economy. So during my childhood, our communities were rapidly transformed by intensive extractive resource development in just one generation. Over 1,000 miles of oil infrastructure was built overnight. I witnessed the environmental degradation, social upheaval, and land use conflicts that accompanied this corporate colonization of my homeland. So it is ironic that I end up working, after working for government and indigenous environmental NGOs, I did end up working for large multinational resource development companies, and that has taken me from the World Bank to the UN to new country entries, assessing risk around development projects in Greenland, Colombia, and Iraq. And during that time, emerged the idea of sustainable rights-based development through the concepts of free, prior, and informed consent. This came from the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People passed in 2007. This is a very important concept to everything that we're talking about today. It is a guidepost to social and environmental justice. And the UN DRIP opened the door for not only recognition, but collaboration with indigenous and vulnerable communities impacted by development. That word collaborative will come up over and over again and already has. So to have sustainable development, we must first have collaborative development. This means involving the people most deeply impacted by whatever it is you're proposing to do, whether you're an environmental NGO proposing to conserve land, building infrastructure, or developing government policy or resource extraction projects. This is an important opportunity. So that's the challenge. The opportunity is right now we can get it right. In other words, it turns out working with people most deeply impacted by development is not just the right thing to do. It also provides us with models of development that could benefit all of us, from project proponent to communities. It is the principle of enlightened self-interest come alive. Now, I'll finish by saying, while I've used the intersection of indigenous peoples and resource development as a way to illustrate this idea of collaborative development, it is an approach that applies anytime you propose to do a project impacting people and communities, whether resource, infrastructure, or environmental policy. So yes, I agree with all the remarks to date. It's time to go beyond consultation and consent and fully embrace collaboration.
Thank you, Terza. Again, sorry for jumping in.
Oh, that's okay. I was done.
Right on time. Thanks. Thank you very much.
Sure.
Our next speaker is Yanel Simonic. She's a senior foresight strategist at Arup, specializing in sustainability, regenerative urban systems, and advanced technology that will shape the future of the built environment. So quite an important point of view. Janelle, at Arup, your work focuses and considers future challenges with a unique role trying to define trends to assess and address change today. So how do you see infrastructure design, rehabilitation, and construction changing, and what changes are needed to drive more positive planetary outcomes? And what are some core challenges to overcome today, problems for a more biodiverse tomorrow? Janelle.
Yeah, thank you, Roberto, and thanks for having me today. Hopefully I can provide a little bit of a perhaps different lens through that of my role as a futurist. So to answer your question, we think that the built environment, when you think about the built environment, it's important to remember that change happens slowly, yet the changes that are made last for decades, if not for centuries. So it's important for us to get it right and to think about, plan for, and envision the future that we might want to live in with every new design that we make. And so this is what I do at Arup. I work with our engineers, designers, consultants, and ecologists to think about the future and better understand the uncertainties ahead. And specifically, I work with our engineers and clients to focus on designing and developing regenerative futures by utilizing the planetary boundaries as a framework to get us there. So in this specific context, I think it's integral to address biodiversity considerations in the planning and development of infrastructure, specifically the design and management of transportation systems through processes such as biodiversity-focused environmental impact assessments and using planning to avoid the most sensitive areas for biodiversity. So one key for us will be the adoption of interventions that ensure ecological connectivity. So things like land bridges for animals to move from one side to another, or eco-ducts or green infrastructure solutions. And then specifically seeing change, our clients lately have been becoming a bit more interested and intrigued by the ideas both of net zero and of net positive, or what is beyond net zero. And so they're saying that the possibilities of building better is a market differentiator and also a way for them to attract new and strong talent. So it's something, like attracting new employees and different types of people. It's also hard to say that we are seeing change, specifically because, it's important to remember that infrastructure, again, changes on timescales of decades. So when we think about what are we seeing, a lot of the times, just because the length of projects takes so long, you see change perhaps slower than in some other industries might. So it takes a little bit of patience on our end. And all of that just to say that in order for us to really ensure a biodiverse tomorrow, we need to tackle habitat loss, fragmentation, and degradation by mainstreaming biodiversity within infrastructure. This means solutions like integrating biodiversity from the national scale through to scheme approvals and funding, through from planning consent into the construction, operations, and maintenance of the infrastructure or physical design long term. So thank you. I'll pass it back to you, Roberto.
Thank you very much, Janelle. Very interesting and quite on time. So thank you again. Next, we have a recorded video from Gwenelle Hello, who's the head of research in the Research and Innovation Department at the General Directorate for Sustainable Development at the headquarters of the Ministry of Ecological Transition in charge of Transport, Energy, and Environment. And the question we asked to Gwenelle was this. We heard about the innovative work from your ministry previously in this series to improve outcomes for biodiversity and linear infrastructure development through collaboration with leading French companies and investments in science and research. What challenges do you see as most important to overcome in increasing private sector investment in nature-based and sustainable infrastructure. So here's Gwenelle's response.
Thank you for this question. So I'm currently replacing Yancy, that could not be with us today, and I will speak about our experiment of the French Ministry for Ecological Transition. First of all, with more than 30% of artificial surfaces, we can say that infrastructures are a major element affecting biodiversity. We can also highlight the fact that infrastructures are represented risks for human health, as they are incursions into natural habitats, and by this, they could play indirectly a role in the dissemination of pathogens. It is then of utmost importance, in order to prevent such impacts, to develop collaborative research for nature-based and sustainable infrastructures. The solutions require a long-term approach and close collaboration between public authorities and industries. In France, for example, we have groups of enterprise, such as EPE for Enterprise for Environment, or also CILB for Linear Infrastructure and Biodiversity. Such structures regrouping infrastructures industries within a common goal around biodiversity. The French experience, and particularly that one of the Ministry for Ecological Transition, in supporting the coordination of funds between the public and private sectors for research and innovation, is almost unique in this field. To make this possible, it requires an involvement at CIO level. France has long been engaged in in-depth work to improve the balance between biodiversity management and preservation, marked very recently by the launch of discussions on the first ISO standard biodiversity for ISO TC 331, that was also supported by the General Commission of Sustainable Development in the Ministry for Ecological Transition. Research and innovation on the subject of infrastructure and biodiversity is an area of consensus between stakeholders. The Ministry of Ecological Transition and the General Commission on Sustainable Development, the CGDD in particular, is leading large national communities in partnership with FRB within our national research program named ITECOP for Transport, Infrastructure, Landscape and Ecosystems. The Ministry is also supporting the development of European stakeholders, like with the Coordination and Support Action CSA Bison, which is a 2020 project, in order to federate resources and supporting the development of the stakeholders concerned. The CSA Coordination and Support Action Project Bison will start by the end of January 2021. The protection of the environment and biodiversity is a shared challenge, and the dissemination of knowledge is essential. So these actions of the dissemination that will develop, for example, by the CEC, are intended to fit the reflection for the next One Planet Summit on 11 January 2021, the IUCN Congress and the future COP15. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you to Gwenelle and to the French Ministry, who is also a great supporter of this initiative, and I have to say has demonstrated a lot of leadership in the past few years. We are now going into the second part of our discussion, and I'm afraid we need to make up some time. The structure of this part is a little bit different than what we have before. So we will now ask some additional questions to the panelists on different aspects of the changes that are needed, to achieve better outcomes for biodiversity. And we want also to start from the new facts on the ground after the COVID-19 crisis, which has changed the landscape in many places also for infrastructure demand. So first question is for Graham and Janelle. And the question is this: how do you think the health crisis and the economic recovery, country priorities for sustainable infrastructure investment have changed for 2021 and beyond? And do you think that the market demand has changed already? And what more fundamental shifts do you see emerging? Graham, Janelle?
Well, perhaps I can begin by saying that for the IDB, for the Inter-American Development Bank, most of our investments have shifted during 2020. We're now focused on health, jobs, liquidity, and fiscal measures. And now we're going to be moving into dealing with vaccines. So just to be pragmatic about this and clear, that means a reduced investment in issues relating to climate and biodiversity. So that's the direct, immediate impact. However, I do think as we look towards the future, there is going to be much increased interest in sustainable infrastructure or ESG investing, which you can kind of group together. And this is basically for three reasons. The first one is it does better. It does better when you deal with shocks. It's shown to have done better during the COVID crisis. Sustainable infrastructure is also part of sustainable recovery. It's a critical element of it. If you're talking about renewable energy, smart grids, electromobility, water and sanitation, digital infrastructure, they're all critical to sustainable recovery. But the last point I'd like to make is that actually, to do that, you actually need substantive changes, and those changes need to be led, I think basically, as Siri said, as an integrated approach coming out of ministries of finance and ministries of planning to be able to drive the agenda forward in accord with Agenda 2030, so in accord with the SDGs. And just to give you one quick example of where this is actually happening, and we always use Costa Rica as an example, but actually their new decarbonization plan demonstrates some of the key advantages of this, one of which is we just did a cost-benefit analysis, and they're going to get $41 billion worth in benefits if they decarbonize over basically up until 2050. So it demonstrates that even if you have upfront investments, your long-term return is much higher when you go sustainable. So I'll just hold it there, and that's a very quick answer to this, but I see that immediately, yes, there's a drop back, but I think that it's actually opening up the ground, and it is a huge opportunity also, as Siri May said, for change. So this is the time for change.
Yeah.
Thank you, Graham.
Yeah, I think just to follow up on that, and with maybe a little different kind of a view, we think that COVID's really shown us that it's possible to renew the natural environment in a short time frame, and if we all work together and follow national guidance. So in just this year alone, we've cut emissions, namely through lack of travel. We've not been using our infrastructure much due to our staying at home, and these seemingly small changes have brought back blue skies around the world. It's given the natural environment a break so that it can replenish itself a bit this year. And we've even seen the rise in insects as they're able to repopulate due to this cleaner air and less interference from humans, which is a kind of a funny one. I know here in the UK there was what was it? There's some sort of a bug that they get in the fall, and it was like the biggest quantity they've had in 20 years or something, which has just been kind of a funny little side effects we've been seeing this year. But in terms of fundamental shifts, I think that the COVID-19 pandemic, with greater awareness and interdependence of biodiversity and human health, is really increasing traction towards the One Health approach. And this pandemic's really provided an unfortunate but necessary to acknowledge and adopt new approaches and better link together and consider global concerns more holistically, which may mean things like increasing the prerequisites in creating spaces for nature within infrastructure developments to improve the health and quality of life for citizens, or to reduce the natural impact from infrastructure. We're also beginning to see this in different ways. For example, the shift from no net loss towards net gain for biodiversity. I think finally, just kind of my hope is that these clear, quick, visible changes we've witnessed this year continue to influence us for priorities for investments going forward, just showing funders that value of nature and on the natural environment.
Thank you, Janelle. Thank you, Graham. Second question I have, again, on the aftermath of COVID-19 that is not over yet, as we know, is there are lots of talks about, the question is for Norbert. We're now, in the middle of economic stimulus and recovery packages being developed around the world. Are these doing enough to shift investment towards sustainability, Norbert? And what can the international community do in 2021 to ensure that they avoid trade-offs between, shovel-ready, quick projects, brown projects, and the necessary shift in nature-based and decarbonization infrastructure? Norbert, what do you think?
Thank you, Roberto. I think basically I would say no, there hasn't been done enough in the recovery programs which are on the ground at the moment in order to really shift towards sustainability to include more nature in general. So that's a general statement. There is a very interesting ongoing research by Vivid Economics, and they have this Green Recovery Index. I'm sure many people know about that, and that demonstrates that very clearly. On the other hand, I can say in the European Union, and I'm representing Germany here, we are just this half year chairing the Council of the European Union. I think we have done a quite good job in including climate and biodiversity aspects in our own recovery programs. And that's also true for many member states, including Germany. So what we would like to do here is leading by example. And the EU biodiversity strategy is also another example where we would like to demonstrate we take it serious. And we hope others will also take it serious, and we will mobilize a lot of internal funding for these efforts. And just now, while we are speaking here, we have the European Council, the leaders of the European Union speaking together, and hopefully, and I'm quite optimistic, they will agree on the multi-annual framework budget and also on the recovery package, which is on the table. I think the opportunity for next year is certainly with the super year, which was not 2020, but which now may be 2021, with all the meetings at hand from the World Biodiversity Congress through the various COPs, biodiversity and climate. I hope revitalized G formats, G7 and G20 with the new US administration, much more progressive. I think we have an opportunity to rethink that and bring it to a higher attention again for all of us, that the green and better recovery is what is really needed. And we are going through a third or to a second wave right now, so there may be more recovery programs. So the opportunity is still there. Not everything is lost. What we, with our small budget, are doing, we are supporting about 25 countries who are asking for that with embedded economic advisors to help them to understand their particular situation and allow them for a better planning, for a better recovery. One in particular area of that is looking in particular at cities. I like to mention that, and I also would like to say that I very much liked the approach from Terza. I think that's really true. What we have to do is to put people at the center. People are suffering most from the health crisis, from the economic crisis, if they're losing their jobs, and they will also suffer if the environment is degrading and climate impacts are coming upon them. I think really addressing people may be the way forward. Over.
Thank you very much, Norbert. And since you mentioned Thursday, I jump to a question to her. So what do you think about the current practice? Is it doing enough to consult all relevant voices, and how can we act more strongly on the learnings from participatory process and that ultimately they save time, cost, avoid conflicts as infrastructure is built and managed over its lifespan? Terza, what do you think?
Thank you, Roberto. I think it's an excellent question, and the answer is no, there's not enough being done, but there are bright spots on the horizon. So we aren't standing still as far as involving the people most deeply impacted by whatever it is we want to do, which is fundamentally what I'm going to keep coming back to, is that over time, we've seen both policy development and infrastructure development from industry. The project plans are created from a corner office somewhere. And people are shocked that the implementation of these projects, whether you're talking about the size of projects I worked on, which is $10 to $15 billion, or talking about building a factory, smaller factory down the street in your own city. The outcomes are often the same, which is if you do not have alignment with the people most deeply impacted by that project, your chances of success are greatly reduced. And how do we get that alignment? And I know somebody brought up alignment early on. Graham also brought up early on the cost of conflict. I think we have to reemphasize that if you do not have alignment, there is an actual cost. This is really important to industry and to project proponents. The cost of that conflict, a few years ago, I did a fair bit of research at Harvard, boils down to this. Out of the top 75% of extractive resource development projects in the world, so there's 190 top projects around the world, 75% of them are stopped or slowed due to conflict. And that conflict is largely conflict with communities at an average cost of about $20 million a week. Now, why is that important? Why should we care? Why shouldn't we just do the right thing with sustainable development? Because a big player in the answer to this is the actual builders of the infrastructure. So we can pass resolutions, we can discuss solutions in our civil society and NGOs, but if we don't have industry in the room and get their attention, then we don't have a high probability of seeing infrastructure change in a dramatic way. I'll say one last point to this. The solution to that is already been mentioned, which is have the people most deeply impacted by these projects in the room at the planning stage. So early on, you can save a lot of time and conflict if the people who are in the region that you want to do your project or build your road or whatever it is you're planning to do in the room as a partner. So I'm saying we must now go beyond consultation and consent, that it has to be collaboration. And that means treating people in the region you want to do business as an equal.
Thanks, Thurza. I fully agree, and I could share stories of that went very sour when this was not done, probably among the 190 projects you mentioned. Thanks a lot. I have a next question for Oliver. What are some of the specific policy changes that we should be pushing for to unlock more private sector capital in nature-based solution and sustainable infrastructure? And what positive example existing today we can learn from? Oliver.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I have three particular suggestions here, although I can't say that they have been extensively applied yet. So it's going to be, and I really just want to highlight the ones that I see from our work with the informal advisory group could be more kind of potentially more the biggest leverage to change what's going to come up with the framework. I would say the first one is certainly to change the incentives. Let's think again about what you said. Today, all the blueprints, all the codes lead to destruction of nature. This is the reality. When I look outside of my street about how the city of Montreal does its own renovation of cities, I would say there's probably 30 to 40% more cement and construction there than needs to be. It could be a lot better. We could have coral reef cities and sponge cities and ports instead of, and this is defined by the kind of incentives. So I'd say incentives is the first. The second thing I think that can break this is champions. We need, because the general environment is still not conducive to nature-based solutions, we need to find countries. For instance, Rwanda is trying to really have a relation with the World Bank that goes not only for infrastructure, but the whole idea of finance for nature can help. So if we find the European Union has a biodiversity strategy and a deal now that is very ambitious for the next years. So what we need is to showcase the champions, the parties, the countries that are making a difference. And I just gave two examples. Singapore, of course, is another one where infrastructure and nature are being bred together, really. So recognizing the champions would be the second. And I would say one thing that can change a lot in infrastructure is the contemplation of risk, the actuarial science in insurance. If we can change the way people see the issue of risk in infrastructure 30, 40 years down the line when the infrastructure is no longer operational, I think we can work back the net present value of natural solutions. So I would say those three are my contributions. And we're beginning to see that several groups, AXA and other insurance groups, are trying to change the very formulation of their vision of risk. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Oliver. Well said. And since you mentioned Singapore, I have a question for Esther. That is actually, you know, what barriers and challenges have you seen in funding and developing sustainable projects on the ground in Asia, also taking into consideration this issue of risks and their incorporation in screening processes, Esther?
Yeah, I think, yeah, thank you, Oliver, for the kind words. And in fact, you know, sustainability now is really mainstream. While along the value chain, there are a few key drivers. Of course, regulators play a very important role. If whatever is mandatory, you have to do it. So that is one key driver. The other one is actually financial, okay? Upstream financial, banking, bankers and all that. So now the trend is actually with the rapid growth of sustainability practices, and you have actually seen this year, sustainable investing has gone, you know, has grown tremendously. So there is definitely incentive, and there's also, you know, higher access of funding, you know, and UNEP FI actually promoting three principles. One is responsible lending, responsible investing, and also sustainable insurance. So as asset owner like us, you know, we own buildings, properties, and all that. So all these three areas, we have to look at it. And in fact, there is a much stronger case now that we have to build and manage and you know, design our building in a sustainable manner, because in the end of the day, it's accountability. Because I have actually, the CDL has actually committed with science-based target validated greenhouse gas emission. And what we commit, we have to also track and deliver. And there is also cost of inaction. Large investment funds like BlackRock and all that already put 50 over company on watch list and actually punish them by voting out the directors if they are deemed not, you know, taking enough climate action. So there is actually cost of cost of inaction. And of course, a lot of, you know, private sector also have to look at business case. So I always look at this in an ABC manner. Alignment is one thing, business case is another. Common good is important. We can't, you know, thrive. Business cannot thrive if the planet is not, you know, healthy. So we need to align all these. You know, we can't also commit that we have to save the world at all costs. If the the business cannot survive, you know, there will be a lot more people will suffer. The employees will suffer, the supply chain will suffer. So we actually always work together. As a developer, we are like the project manager. We actually have a vision how to design, and we work with architect and we work with consultant, you know, such as Arab and all that. We actually work with some project in Singapore together. And how we design and build and manage, and we look at the long, you know, span of the lifespan of building. Some can even go to like, you know, 80 years, 100 years. So how do we upgrade it and maintain it as, you know, energy efficient, resource efficient, and not causing damage to the environment? And of course, people are the most important thing. now COVID, has taught almost all my tenants become expert of IAQ, indoor air quality, greenery, is it safe to come back to work, So I think consumer activism is very important because consumer nowadays talk like expert, especially when we talk about the younger generation. They will ask for like, is your home green? Do you have recycling facility? They will ask a lot of, demand now. So we are operating in a very fast changing world. What we now provide this year may not be the same as 2 years later or 3 years later. We have to be limber. We have to, adjust and adapt to the new normal and the ever-changing, new normal.
Thank you, Esther. Very well said. At this point, I think we need to make up some time for, to finish on time. So I want to change a little bit the structure of the next part. We have about, 10, 15 minutes. And so I'm going to ask a question to all the panelists, and the question has to do with two main issues. The first is we have seen a lot of interesting potential solutions and pilot projects and ideas in the past editions of this series. And so how do you think we should scale up this solution? So in essence, what needs to happen, to move to the next step and really mainstreaming all of that? And the second part of the question I want to ask everybody is, what gives you hope for next year and beyond in terms of achieving the results that we want to achieve in protecting biodiversity? And I will ask the question one by one and really give you 2 minutes to answer. And I will start with Janelle.
Oh. Thanks for picking me first. So I think I might mush them together a little bit in terms of tangible solutions and scalable options, but there's quite a few of both. First is thinking about how to develop a prerequisite and funding approval to adopt the delivery of improvements for ecosystems. So thinking of a net gain approach. So again, some of the things other people were talking about earlier with the policies today, are kind of designed to degrade the environment. So how do we figure out ways to change that? So that, changing the approach would also do things like include ensuring landscape connectivity more broadly throughout a city. Something that's simple that we can all do is, it can be as simple as doing something like composting or really using your existing materials better to cut and more often. So change isn't necessarily made only by overarching policies. It's made by little things that we do every day. And if we can do them collectively, that's also a huge way to drive change. And then furthermore, I think that it'd be really awesome if we could figure out a way to develop a unified vision for a global future that could benefit all of us. And just to remember that we only have one planet. We're currently using 1.6 planets of resources, and the model itself is fundamentally unsustainable. So we know that if we can continue on this current trajectory, there's only one direction we're heading, and it's not up. So, this is our only planet and we live on it together. So my hope for all of us is that we recognize this, and it helps propel us to work more together and to help, design more positive planetary outcomes.
Thank you, Janelle. And by the way, for you and me, it's 2.7 planets, and for our French friends,
yes. Well. It does depend on the country, right?
Yes, thank you very much. Graham, solutions and hope. What would be your final word on these two aspects of for the future?
Okay, firstly, I'd say that there are lots of examples, but there's nowhere near enough examples of doing the right thing. I don't think there's a single tangible solution that will result in what we want to see. But I think it's everyone working together to overcome the barriers and move forward. I do think there's going to be acceleration because of technological and institutional and business advances. And I think that we all need to take heart in the fact that transformations, once they begin, can occur very rapidly. I'm always drawn to the example of 14 years to take horses out of New York City and replace them with cars, but it was cost driven. It very quickly, once these changes happen, they're gonna continue. And right now we're seeing that with renewable energy prices dropping way below the costs of traditional forms of generating energy, and electromobility is very close behind. It's going to happen, and the question is, when does it happen? But once it flips, it's going to flip really quickly, and we should be aware of that. And I also think the example should become the norm. And I really want to mention Costa Rica as a shining example of going out there and doing decarbonization, but doing it as a whole country effort. Barbados, whole country effort on resilience with the roof to reef concept, and Chile, which is actually creating a huge sovereign green bond, which actually supports sustainable infrastructure. Just 3 examples, but there are many other examples of other whole countries and cities moving forward. I love the Singapore examples as well. Hope, yeah, sustainable recovery is the opportunity today, and we all have to drive in that direction, because we have to use the pandemic as an opportunity. And I think, Roberto, you said it at the beginning, we have to be very careful of people with business as usual trying to jump into that agenda. They cannot, they have to go. Sorry, I'm being a little political there, but this is the opportunity. This is a unique opportunity. We're not going to get another opportunity like this. We have to do it now, and we have to learn the lessons from these other places. So that I'll finish with.
Thank you very much, Graham. Very well said and understood. Esther, what is your take on scaling solutions, and what's your hope?
Okay, well, definitely technology. The good news is technology solutions are quite, aplenty now. So, but they don't come cheap. Okay, and you definitely have, to join the race, to net zero. But how are we going to, enable all these technology solutions and all that? So the good news is we can see more investors and financial institutions are more prepared to, to fund innovations. And we rolled out the first green bond in Singapore in 2017, and green finance, green loans, and SDG innovation loans last year. And we have seen, a lot of, uptick now. It's gaining traction. Okay. And the loan are also getting offering more incentive now, better in terms of pricing. So real estate sectors are the actually biggest users of green financing in Singapore. And this whole week we have the fintech in Singapore here, and the Monetary Authority actually have wrote out a lot of plan. Last year was the $2 billion green financing, program, and now we also have like green finance grant. So it will help, to really, propel such, with a little bit of sweetener, it will start the ball rolling. And hopefully those, private developers and builders and all that have seen the benefits, the social benefits and the economic benefits and the planet, and the environmental benefits. And hopefully it will become the norm. But you just need someone to start the engine and then, propel it to forward first. Then until it becomes a norm that you don't need incentive and you will do it yourself. But, it's not happening yet, but we are seeing some light in the tunnel. And I think awareness is growing. Hopefully with awareness, there will be, action coming. Yes.
Thank you.
I'm always positive in thinking. Yeah.
We need that, Esther, and good examples. So, Thirza, what is your hope, and how do you think about upscaling solutions?
Yeah, I really like this question. Thank you. Yeah, I guess I'd say this. Scaling up whose solutions? That's a question for us to think about. Okay, because I think we've got an awful lot of history of the Western world and European world specifically coming up with solutions and imposing them on people. And we've seen how unsuccessful that has been. And I would suggest that there are different places that we can look for solutions how we live better on the planet. And those solutions aren't in this room, in this Zoom room. They're out there in the communities. So this idea of scaling up really should be more about, let's scale down. Let's find these new ways of being, new to us, but old to certain people around the world. I'll use one quick example because I've been fairly general, I think, and haven't been throwing out specific examples. But we in the U.S. Arctic have one of the largest lead zinc mines in the world, the Red Dog mine, and it has successfully operated for over 30 years. But prior to operation, it is set dead center in the middle of 11 rural and remote indigenous villages, Inupiat villages, my cousins to the south. And how did this mine get placed in the middle of the U.S. Arctic, pristine environment? Well, it took over 10 years of working with the people of the region and making the people of the region invested in the ultimate success of the mine from a social, environmental, and a monetary standpoint. So after 10 years of brokering a deal between the Inupiaq of the Northwest Arctic and a Canadian mining company, we had Red Dog Mine born. And why is that important? Well, the people of the region were equity partners. The Inupiat of the region were equity partners. We run the mine. This isn't a solution that was developed in a corner office or in The Hague or in Geneva or in New York. This was a way of doing development that actually was born out of the region in which it happened. And this is a very large project. So I would use that as an example of how do you do successful development? Well, you ask the people where you're going to do it, how they would do it. And if we come up that context matters, and there is not one size that fits all, and context, understanding the context of where we want to do development takes time. So we have to build that into all of our sustainable development project plans.
Thank you very much, Thurza. Thanks a lot. And I will now ask Oliver for his view of solutions and hope.
I want to bring one that is coming up in the convention extremely strongly lately, which is still not so discussed. It's the contribution of subnational governments. This brings me a lot of hope. You have the national governments, in our view, then you have something that is the first one below that we call subnational. This could be provinces, this could be states, and then you have the local, the municipalities. But it is amazing how many subnational governments, and I'm talking here about, California, the state of Quebec, my home state of Sao Paulo in Brazil, which is responsible for about 50% of the GDP in Brazil. They have a Secretariat of Environment and Infrastructure. That's the official name of that secretariat. So they bring together issues like water. The Community of Madrid, for instance, which is a subnational government and a member of a region, Committee of the Regions in Europe, they have an enterprise called Canal de Isabel II, which is one of the most innovative water management companies in the world. And when you're talking hydroelectrical, is the case of Quebec and Sao Paulo, you're talking about very sustainable infrastructure and very sustainable investments as well. So I think one of the most optimistic, that makes me feel optimistic, is the fact that California, for instance, as a state has decided to join the Convention on Biological Diversity, even though the United States is not a signatory. So imagine what California can do in terms of infrastructure. So the coming on board of subnational governments is a particular source for optimism for me, because they execute a lot of the infrastructure.
Thank you very much, Oliver. And finally, Norbert, the voice from one of the leaders in this game, that is Germany and the German government. I need to ask you to do it in 1 minute, Norbert. Thank you very much.
Yeah, two questions, and I would like to combine them, because how to scale up and what gives hope. I think what gives hope is the opportunity, is a prerequisite for scaling up. And when I've started thinking about the question, I was first thinking about international organizations. I'm very happy to hear the enthusiastic points which were made by Graham. I think we need the international organizations, all of them, in particular the MDBs. to take on their responsibility much stronger, maybe along the lines which Graham outlines. And then the next level, the national governments and the subnational governments. Oliver just mentioned that. What we can see here, for next year coming up, which really makes hope, is we have momentum. We have some momentum in particular in the area of climate, with net zero announcements in Asia, China, India, Korea, also Canada. We have momentum on the combination between on the links between nature and climate, with nature-based solutions as the option. It is an topic now in the climate area, which is a little bit more my community, but it links perfectly to the biodiversity community. We see lots of synergies there, and it's taken up very strongly with the One Planet Summit led by France, but also with the nature campaign by UK in the preparation of COP26. What also provides me of hope is what Oliver just said, what cities are doing. Many cities are very active. They really understand that you cannot distinguish between environment, biodiversity, and climate. They put it all together in providing more sustainable and better recovery plans. But they need the support from the upper levels, which is absolutely crucial and not yet there everywhere. And finally, I think also quite hopeful is what I'm hearing from the private sector. Wouldn't say in general, not all companies, not all businesses, not all sectors, but in many sectors, surprisingly, it's more and more understood. In particular, taking serious risk which comes from climate change and from biodiversity loss now more and more into the internal considerations of the companies will make a big change. And the finance sector is starting that. If they start to redirect their investments in more sustainable flows, which is beginning and is happening already, I think that will really be one of the key drivers for scaling up. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Norbert. And I want to thank all the panelists. Apologize for being sometimes rude to them, but I think we managed almost on time. So I am now calling for Ryan to give us a quick conclusion. And thank you very much, everyone, and to the audience.
Thank you so much, Roberto, to moderating a difficult session here with very tight timelines. And thank you so much to the panel for devoting the time to this discussion. We could have easily talked about this for another couple hours. I want to say thank you to all of these organizations that collaborated with us in holding the Infrastructure and Nature series. If you want to see recordings of each of these sessions, you can go to this address or just iene.info where you will see the link to the series itself. But just again, and I want to especially thank Priscilla. Priscilla, I don't know if you're there and you want to turn on your video, for working behind the scenes to help us really organize all of this. We couldn't have done it without you, Priscilla. So yeah, thank you, Priscilla. Thanks so much to all of you who have participated with us throughout and joined us for nearly all of these sessions. You will hear more from us in the coming weeks and months as we plan for more in the future, and hopefully a second series. So have a great rest of your day, everyone, and thank you so much to all of our panelists. We look forward to being in touch. Happy holidays, Happy New Year. Talk to you soon.